But it is the amazing array of plants that comes next that is the real news. And this is, I claim, and my students claim, the potential beginning of an understanding of the origins of African American gardening. Pollen from plants collected by enslaved people include blueberries, strawberries, cranberries, broccoli, and mustards. These all grow wild around here, but can be gathered and probably were. Then there is Seneca snakeroot, buckbean, gingerroot, arrowhead, arsmart, and phlox. These aren't in your medicine chests anymore, but there was a time. Then, these are all medicinal plants. Buckbean deals with diarrhea. Arrowhead is an analgesic and is used for gastrointestinal purposes. One of these lifts depression. Another is a cure-all. Only where Africans lived is there scouring rush for cleaning and field horsetail used to fill mattresses and line floors. According to my colleague Leone Edwards Ingram at Williamsburg, she did research on African American gardens in Virginia, and some of these plants represent ways in which slaves took care of their own physical and spiritual well-being through traditional medical and cultural practices. During and after slavery, for example, the leaves of plantains were used to produce a salve for the treatment of burns. Phlox, which includes Sweet William, is considered a good luck charm and is carried in pockets. Weeds, such as arsmart, have been deliberately allowed to thrive in some gardens because of its medicinal value. The pollen shows an environment full of edible plants and plants whose properties were long known here and in the rest of the Bay Area by Native Americans. People who lived in the quarter knew, harvested, and used everything they understood in plant life. Now, here are the research questions. But did enslaved Africans propagate, domesticate, and grow all these plants? The answer comes either from the old Frederick Douglass history of the Eastern Shore or the new interpretation of the Eastern Shore inspired by the unveiling today. Either slaves had masters and obeyed and were passive and were destroyed, or there is a life and a culture alive today that they made and we live out. It is the second that is true. Enslaved people made and used the environment. We see in the actual greenhouse room many of these same foods and medicines. In 1775, we see pollen from the family that includes cherries, plums, apricots, and strawberries. There is also Seneca snakeroot. We see water lilies. Then, from 1785 to 1795, after the heating system was introduced into the greenhouse, we see what we would expect. And this was the image that you could all gather, if we were allowed an image, and we are. Lilies, crocuses, geraniums, pinks, irises, oranges, lemons, but we also see buckbeans, strawberries, bananas, but only a few medicinal plants and only some food. We see tropical plants and those forced to bloom early. But we have a picture of African American cultivation on the one hand and European cultivation in the greenhouse in the 18th century on the other. There is more variety in the quarter because there is more plant food there and less in the greenhouse itself. And that's just an observation. The pollen analysis falls into a context at White House and American gardening in general at a time when American farmers and plantation owners were beginning what is still called scientific gardening. The practice was an experimental effort to match soils, plants, and climate. This was part of the effort at White House from the 1770s on and through the first half of the 19th century. It also, of course, produced a large slave population, including Douglass. Scientific gardening involved the transfer of plants around the European colonial world with two goals. One was to increase productivity, and the other was to see what could be grown successfully where a species had not been grown before. Together, these two processes are sometimes known as green imperialism, and it's the imperialism part of it, the worldwide spread of plants for experimental purposes that Europe started that I want to call on now. The transfer of plants throughout the Dutch, French, and English maritime worlds by boat featured two elements, both of which we see at White House, and which I think also existed at all of the hundreds of plantations along the shores and rivers of Chesapeake Bay. And there are probably more than hundreds. One was a corps of professional experts in plants and farming. The other was islands. The greenhouse is an island, by which Europeans mean a utopia, and by which in the 18th century Europeans did not mean something that was necessarily kind. Frederick Douglass tells us that the Lloyds brought Mr. McDermott from Scotland as a scientific gardener. McDermott used 4 slaves to run the garden at Y. Douglass describes the variety of plant foods at Y and the extent of the gardens. This was mostly a food garden. While we do not yet know much about McDermott, we do know that he was part of a worldwide exchange of seeds and live plants that strings together John Bartram of Philadelphia, who was a hero of the Revolution, and the Quakers all along the East Coast. That includes the Quakers here in Easton, and of course at Tulip Hill, which is only 20 or 30 miles west of here across the bay. The string includes Kew Gardens in London, a book written by Stephen Bordley on Y Island, just to the north of here, about how to design and build a rational plantation to maximize land, labor, and profit. Bordley was William Paker's immediate neighbor on Y Island, where we excavated for 4 years and where we found archaeological evidence for the massive African-American built engineering efforts that go into building plant landscapes for showing plants and for controlling human labor. The string ends, and for me it began, in the library at Y House with its illustrated copy of Philip Miller's Gardener's Dictionary, which is probably the most popular gardening and landscaping manual of the 18th century English-speaking world. The Gardener's Dictionary is an encyclopedia. It's enormous, that explains how every aspect of a large planned landscape worked. While it was for formal gardening, it includes all of the plant experiments needed for improving plant yields on any plantation, and it is of European extent. Robert Grove, who is my guide here, points out that islands were often the initial landfalls for European explorers, and that they were easier to describe and colonize because they were so clearly bounded. Grove's enduring point for us is that such islands in all the seas that Europeans sailed became a utopian place in literature and in missionary and farming reality, as well as a place to collect plants. A utopia is an ideal place completely under human control, and under human control in this context you should read from all kinds of points of view. Everybody here has read Walden too. You know, that's a positive and a negative book. Most utopias are islands, or so self-isolating that they amount to being islands. The greenhouse is like a utopia. The long promenade in the greenhouse room at Y is a place for looking and inspecting the plants arrayed there. If people entered through the open south-facing windows, which is how large citrus trees are now taken in and out for the change of seasons, then people walked on the tile floor that still runs the entire southern edge of the room. Now that we know some of what grew in the large room, we can visualize all these plants in pots, none in the ground, which appears not to have been cultivated, and these would have been grouped by species and ranked by height and the need for light and shade. Imagine, because it happened, heat and cold in the winter. The furnace in the greenhouse's northeast room led to an underground channel that ran along the east side, then under and in front of the 10 large south-facing windows, then along and up the west wall, and then rose to a height of 5 feet along the north rear wall of the greenhouse, finally to go up the chimney as both smoke and heat. This is a big, tall room, almost 2 stories high. It could not have been overly heated and should not have been for the plant's health. Some plants that left pollen need 45 degrees Fahrenheit, others 65 degrees Fahrenheit. Some need one temperature for survival, others a different and a higher one for forcing. There was considerable temperature variation needed at any one time in the greenhouse, and because there was only one source of heat, there must have been ways of arraying plants so that they got the right amounts. Crocus can be brought into flower early with warmth, but oranges and lemons cannot be overheated, or they will blossom before they should. So we have a plant environment, a plant utopia. This was a complex system of plants, and slaves who are not part of the utopia were also a part of it. Drake Whitty and Richard Tillman found a prehistoric pestle mortared in place in the peak of the furnace arch just last summer, which is a way of understanding that Our commitment to this building, both its maintenance and its understanding, is ongoing. Drake Whitty, who is an experienced mason who understands 18th century mortar and bricks, concludes that the pestle was placed there by the furnace builder. The pestle is part of a West African spirit bundle tradition connected to fire and lightning. This is the second West African bundle found in the greenhouse, and it is a kind of present, as is the first bundle to Mrs. Green. Within this environment are people of African descent who have created their own world, and this is actually what I think we are discovering. We have plenty of evidence that Africans knew the food environment very well. Amanda Tang, who is writing her doctoral dissertation on food at White House, particularly regarding how slaves fed themselves, has identified thousands and thousands of discarded food animal remains from quarter environments and has found that enslaved Africans hunted, fished, gathered oysters, ate wild birds, must have raised chickens, and exploited most of the woods, marshes, bogs, and waters surrounding the bay. Surrounding Y in the bay. They did this in addition to eating the rations of pork, herring, and corn distributed to them monthly. They weren't supposed to, but they did. From this, we can see that plants in the greenhouse come from these same environments. Many, maybe most, are wild foods, or they started off that way. We do not yet know how they were cultivated in the 18th century. We do not yet know their genetic structures and how they were managed so that they were actually domesticated to make them more productive for human use. We want to maintain the hypothesis that we can see in the greenhouse the least expected and most promising offshoot of European scientific utopian gardening, and that is African American gardening. If an island utopia is filled with nature's forms made more perfect by human control, learning, management, and understanding, then we need to admit that there is one element Europeans never intended to import into their utopias. Foreign cultures were not welcome, alive, and healthy. Nonetheless, what we see at Y is creative, exploratory, self-sufficient, daring, African, and imaginative. This hypothesis is that the pollen at the Y greenhouse shows a full understanding of European gardening and agriculture and a full use and understanding of the natural food-producing environment too. It is a beginning of our understanding of African American gardening. Such gardening features in its classic forms: swept yards, fencing, plants with many medicinal properties, domesticated animals for food and edible plants, the spirit world as well. There is no doubt that African American gardening produces food and flowers. Sometimes there is a swept area. Sometimes there are ornaments like pinwheels, hubcaps, bottles on trees, trellises with diamond spaces, arbors with grates with many openings, white stones and blue shutters. The European eye sees irregular places, a few right angles, overlapping zones, and things placed as though they were in the way. But that's the wrong perspective. Here in Talbot County on Maryland's eastern shore, 3 African Americans have already told me the tradition of African American gardening exists. No one seems to have recorded it yet, but we at the university want to. And my newest graduate student, doctoral student, Beth Pruitt, who's here this afternoon, wants to take that on. So Beth will be available afterwards, and I invite you to talk with her if you have any sense of African American gardening. And we need to find out, because it began at White House and at every other plantation on the eastern shore. It's in the mustards, the Seneca snake root, the ginger root, the buck bean found in the 1775 quarter at the Y greenhouse. And so you see what's significant here that adds to this morning is this 250 years of highly specified information in the ground on the origins of African American culture here, and particularly of how African Americans utilized and domesticated the natural environment, and that's entirely parallel with the scientific tradition of European agriculture that began and continues up through to today. This gardening tradition